It's good to see everybody. All right, so we'll be picking up on page 90 of the book. Everybody excited? You enthused to be here? I am. I'm super pumped to be here. That's where you're supposed to start class, right? Ain't that where we left off? Show some enthusiasm. I'm just trying it out on y'all. I'm just kidding. I'm always excited to be here. Sometimes a little bit nervous, but I'm always excited. So this is where we left off last week. So this is, I guess as of tonight, we got 5 classes left and we got like 7 lessons. So some of these I'm going to kind of go through rather quickly. The next one we'll talk about some specific aids that we can use, and then we'll talk about discipline, and then we'll start getting into some more specifics as far as class level stuff. So some of the stuff we'll kind of go through quickly. I do want to go ahead and read through, or I want you to read through the remainder of the book, but again, some of it we'll go through kind of quickly. So finishing up right now on presenting the lesson, and we talked about this just at the tail end of the last class, and this is key, especially when you're teaching younger kids, because if you're not enthusiastic about what's going on, you're going to lose them quick, fast, and in a hurry. And once you lose them, it's like a fish. They're gone. You can't ever get them back. So from the get-go, you've got to make sure that you are into it, and the material that you're presenting is age appropriate. One of the things that he's talked about in the book several times is the fact that the Bible is real. All the stories are real. These are real people. These are real places. And we need to make these stories come to life. And so in any way that you can, making these stories come to life is something that's going to be key. And the fact that from an early age, the kids aren't as well acquainted with some of these stories. And so you're the link from them being able to understand those stories. And so make sure that you're doing everything that you can. He's told a story, and I can't remember if it was in this section. I've told you before, sometimes I get the stories mixed up, but he actually has a story, maybe in this lesson, where he's talking about an elder in the church that didn't really spend a whole lot of time with the class in general. And we've read about some examples of some teachers and some pretty bad things. And this is something I could see a teacher saying if they come to a part of the Bible that they just don't really find that interesting. Man, look, I'm just going to be up front with you right off the bat. It's pretty boring. We got to go through it, but it's pretty boring. Don't ever do that to a class, okay? Even if we're talking about Leviticus, okay? Don't ever tell a class that this particular section is boring. And it's okay if you are teaching something that's hard to admit that. I think that from everything that I've read, the majority of the Bible is on like a 4th grade or a 6th grade level. So it's mostly easy to understand, but there are some difficult things. Peter even acknowledges Paul can be pretty difficult to understand sometimes. And so there are going to be some difficult things, and it's okay to admit that. But in the process of admitting that, you let the kids know, but we're going to be able to figure it out. We're going to figure it out together. And so make sure that you have that confidence and that they can see that in you. So he says in the book, if you cannot make yourself enthused over the material to be taught, either change material or give up the class. And again, Mr. Waldron is pretty blunt. You don't beat around the bush. So if you can't be enthused about what you're teaching, then you better figure something else out. Do not ruin a portion of the scriptures for your pupils by your own negative reaction. And you could ruin a section of scriptures for the lifetime, because how you present it, if you present it in a negative light, and if this kid is very impressionable, that will be what they remember forever. Well, I remember this Bible class teacher one time when I was in the 3rd grade, and they just didn't like this section, and so I don't like this section. And so you can do that to a child, which is an absolutely horrible thing to do. So make sure that we're not doing that as Bible class teachers. We've talked about this many times. Whenever you are presenting the material, that you make sure that you are presenting the main point. And so ask these questions whenever you're presenting a point. Why did God include this story in the Bible? And we've talked about making sure how we frame what's happening and maybe in a particular story in reference to the whole Bible. And so you can ask the question, why did God include this particular story in the Bible? What is he wanting us to get out of that? What point did the inspired writer have in mind when mentioning a character in a story? And so these are things that we can be asking to make sure that we're getting out the material, what needs to be gotten out of it. Never let the definition of a word or a concept detract from the primary point to be taught, and we can get so bogged down in words that, again, we lose the point that we need to be focused on. And that can happen as a teacher, but it can also happen as a student, and so you got to make sure you keep class on track, and you don't let the students, the inmates run the asylum, and they start pulling you away with, well, what about this and what about that? And so don't get bogged down with words. Be careful of acting out stories in the Bible. If you do, make sure that the focus of the acting stays on the primary point and does not stray away from it. And we'll talk a little bit more about this with the next lesson. But one of the points that they make is you can spend a lot of time and effort and money on costumes and trying to get the students to recreate a story. And in certain situations, that could be very beneficial. But you also have to recognize that if you put so much emphasis on those things and you don't put enough emphasis on the actual story, then you've lost them. And so if they walk away and all they can talk about is the costumes and, well, you know, I got to play the king and you had to play the pauper, and they don't understand the story that the whole thing was about, then you've lost them. So be careful with that. Another way of missing a primary point of a lesson is to stray off course on some pet peeve that the teacher has. Stay focused on the Bible and not your opinion. And he hits on this pretty hard because we all have our pet peeves. And one of the things that he talks about in here is drugs and alcohol and teenagers that are just all horrible. And so, you could have some story that has nothing to do with teenagers and how they act, but somehow or another it always goes back to that. So the kids walk away thinking, well, I guess every Bible story is just all directed at teenagers and how horrible we are. So don't get up on your soapbox and start preaching and teaching something that isn't what is being taught with the scriptures that you're going over. So be careful of that. Kids are pretty smart. They can learn pretty fast that, okay, well, let's not talk about this around Mr. Jason because we know that's his pet peeve. He mentions there often the comment is made about someone, it is amazing how much he got out of that one little verse. The truth is that when a teacher spends 3 weeks on one verse, he is not getting material out of it. He is putting material into it. And we've all been in situations, if you're old enough, you've been in situations like that, where it's like, okay, for the last 3 Bible classes, we've literally talked about one verse. And so, don't do that. And you're not getting much out of it at that point. He also says, remember, God never wasted space. His providence has preserved the information and lessons he thought we needed to know. Therefore, we need to include every portion of the Bible, and we need to be sure we find the lessons he intended in each portion we study. And that, again, that's a key thing with everything that we are teaching, making sure that we are teaching exactly what we are expected to get out of that particular lesson. So general rules about methods. Use a method that works nicely with the age group you have, and we've hit on that several times throughout the book, that, depending upon the age, there are going to be certain things that work better. Storybooks, and so with a very young class, it's something that may be good, but with older classes, obviously it's not going to be very good. Use a method that works with this group at this moment. And so you may have a particular group that maybe you just taught them last quarter or 2 quarters ago, and this method worked, and for whatever reason, it ain't working. And so again, don't be so stubborn that, no, it's going to work. I'm going to make it work. If it's not working, then we got to be willing to change up our method. And I think this is just an observation. The older I get, the harder it is for us to change. I know I've always heard you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and I do believe there's a certain amount of truth to that. We got to be careful that we don't become old dogs in Bible class as Bible class teachers, because we can get very set in our ways, and we just think this is the way I've always done it, and that's the way I'm always going to do it. Well, if the way you've always done it ain't working now, then don't do it. We have to be willing to adjust and change up our methods to make sure that we're getting the most out of the class. Give an overview of the material first, then zero in on the details. And he talks about this quite a bit, the review aspect of things and how you're making sure that the kids are getting out of the class what they need to be getting out of the class. And so there's a lot of importance with this review thing. Again, talking about how this particular story might fit into the whole scheme of the Bible is something that is very important. One of the things that I really liked, he says there at the bottom of page 92, he says, how would you teach someone what an elephant looks like? So if you got to teach someone what an elephant looks like, would you let him look through a microscope at a skin cell first? Is that really going to give somebody an idea of what an elephant looks like? Yeah, but is it going to give him any idea what an elephant looks like? No. Or would you show him a picture of the whole animal? And so keep those things in mind as you are preparing your material. Use a method that does not require outside assignments before the upper elementary grades except on rare occasions. This is a hard one for me because I just want the kids work. Just want to give them work to do. And the point that he makes is, I can't okay, this is what age you should start doing this and don't do this. He's just saying from his experience, it doesn't work very well. And obviously the expectation is going to be on the parents and in the home to be teaching certain things and teaching responsibility to the kids. But if you give a second grader an assignment that they got to then come back next week and do, that's very difficult without the parents being extremely involved. And he makes the point that the parents may be doing their own thing. It's not your responsibility to tell the parents what they should be doing with their kid. And so a kid that may be in school, it's hard enough for them to remember an assignment that they have to turn in the very next day. And you're asking them to remember it a week out. And so there's not a lot of benefit to that, again, from his experience. And he reiterates the fact that, we know that this 30 repetitions, effective repetitions to really get it into memory. But with the younger kids, you've got to recognize that the parents are responsible for them in the home, and so we can't give them too much. And again, you can't be telling the parents, look, this is what you need to be teaching your kid. He mentions that you might give the parents a broad outline of the material that you expect to cover at the first of each quarter, and I think that's great. I think that if you're a teacher of young kids, anything that you can do as far as communication with the parents, I think is great. I don't think that happens enough when things at the beginning so that the parent has an idea. Of course, whenever we start the 3.5-year study, we all kind of know, at least on that Sunday or Wednesday, whichever class we're going to do that, everybody's going to know kind of what you're doing. But if you're in a situation where we're not doing that, then it's great to give an overview up to the parents, let them know, so then they can be reinforcing things at home. Do not be satisfied with surface knowledge, and especially with the older kids. Make sure that we're not making it too easy for them, that they're actually learning, that they're growing. And that's the expectation that we should have, is that they're going to grow in the time that they spend with us in each quarter. And then if the pupils are not learning the material, it is your fault, not the parents. It's your personal task to teach the material that you have chosen. And he says that you've chosen. Obviously, most times you don't have a say. Sometimes you do have a say, but most times you don't. So if your students are not learning, look at yourself and ask these questions. Am I offering anything of value? Again, you just got to look in the mirror. And am I really doing the best job that I can be doing? Is it the best material for their age and Bible knowledge? And that could be a problem. Maybe you're presenting things well and you're doing the best you can. It's just the material may be over their head, be not appropriate for their age level. And so hopefully that's something that you'll recognize before you actually start teaching the class. But if not, then maybe there's some adjustments that need to be made. Am I trying to teach more than the student's ability at this point? And this is one that's tough, but you got to continue asking questions and kind of see where everybody is at. But you've also got to recognize that, we're pretty blessed that we have so many different Bible classes, but you could still have a pretty big age range, or sometimes maybe not even age range, but sometimes skill. Thank you, Lena. just trying to find the politically correct word to use. And I'm not talking about anybody's kids, but sometimes even they're the same age, and some kids are here and some kids are here, and that's fine. But you've got to recognize that and make sure that you're teaching at the appropriate level. And that's something that could change even throughout the quarter. Am I using a method suitable for their age and ability? We've talked about that. Do I know the material well enough to teach it? And that's a big one. Maybe, again, you're the problem because you don't know the material well enough. And so in that situation, then you got to start working harder to learn the material more to be able to teach it better. Am I controlling the children so they can all listen? And we'll talk about this more whenever it gets to discipline. And I mentioned about the inmates running the asylum. And to me, it kind of reminds me of when I was in school and the substitute walks in and everybody's like, oh yeah, it's going to be a good day. And I'm just going to be honest with you. If you're a pushover, then they're going to take advantage of you. We got a lot of good kids down there, but they're kids. And when they know they can take advantage of you, many of them's going to take advantage of you. And so you got to make sure that you take control of the class. And part of that could be that somebody's got good intentions. Somebody's got good motives, and maybe they're asking questions, but they keep asking questions, and they keep talking, and they keep talking, and they keep talking. And so you have to control that. That's your job as the teacher, to control that and make sure that you're staying on track. Am I making the lesson interesting enough to hold their attention? And again, that's a big one where you need to learn. And if things aren't going very well and they're not really, you're not really holding their attention, then you're going to have to try some different things. And maybe you can start the Ron Daly method, and you start clapping or you start stomping and people start waking up, and sometimes you might have to do that. Am I reviewing enough to keep the information fresh in their mind? And one of the keys that he talks about with this idea of reviewing. And so you could learn something maybe in the first couple of lessons, and if you don't review it by the time you get to the end of the quarter, well, then they don't remember because you didn't review. And so you want them to retain as much information as possible. Are they going to retain everything that you taught them in that quarter? No, that's impossible. But the very important things you have to continue to review so that they can retain that information by the time they get to the end of the quarter. And not just by the time they get to the end of the quarter. You want them retaining this information for life. You want to be one of them teachers that they look back on and they say, you know what, I learned this when I was in the 5th grade for, teacher so-and-so, and I'll never forget it. All right, so general rules about visual and written aids. And again, the next lesson that we'll get to is specifically talking about aids. It says, make sure the visual aid helps present the primary part of the lesson and is not a time filler or a plaything. And that is something that can happen very easily, that we are just trying to get the class over with, and we pick maybe an activity that is going to take up a lot of time. We know it's going to take up a lot of time, but it doesn't really help enhance the story or enhance their learning experience, and so make sure that you're not doing that. Before using an aid, ask yourself, what lesson did the Holy Spirit intend for mankind to learn? And then consider if the aid is helping to teach this point. If not, do not use the aid. And again, it's all about making sure that that you're taking advantage of the time and teaching what needs to be taught. Only use an aid that allows you to teach the most information in the least amount of time. Our Bible class time is precious and does not need to be wasted. I think this is the section. Yeah, actually it's this next one. So some visual aids are too costly to use and time-consuming to use. And we'll talk about that again with the lesson 10 with some specific aids. And yes, there are things that we can purchase that, okay, is it really, in lack of a better term, is it really worth the money? Is it really going to enhance their ability to learn that much more? So make sure that you pay attention to that. Some visual aids are too closely associated with playtime to be effective, and he talks about Play-Doh to model something. And in that situation, your class can oftentimes turn into it's all about playtime, and then the kids are comparing, well, mine's a whole lot better than yours, and They don't even care what the lesson was. They're just trying to outdo one another in their Play-Doh model. So don't let that happen. An aid is to be just that, an aid, not your entire lesson. And so don't plan or don't have your lesson plan be all about, whatever particular activity that you're going to be working on. Workbooks are an aid of what is to be taught, not the only thing that you do in class. And we've talked about that. He's hit on it multiple times, that you can't use the workbook really as a crutch, that you have to make sure that you're teaching the Bible and that is in fact being used just simply as an aid. Remember that visual aid and written aids are nice and can reinforce topics taught, but they are not necessary. Your students do not need to be entertained. They need facts on which to base their faith. And that can happen, I think it's easier with the younger classes where we get so consumed with doing activities. And, we talk about being enthusiastic and trying to make an impression on the kids, and we want to be liked. And so sometimes we can get drawn into, well, what activity are they going to like the best? And not asking the question, what activity is going to enhance me teaching them this particular story? So, again, be careful of that. Faith should not be based on technology, but the avenue to which we reach a young learner and get them to realize and build faith can rely on technology. And this is not in the book. This is something I just come up with. And especially in the day and age that we live in with technology, and that's a great aid that we have to our advantage, but it can also become a disadvantage. But again, we have to recognize that someone's faith is not going to be based on technology, but we can use that to enhance their faith, and we need to make sure that is exactly what we're doing. All right, so as a teacher, we'll all give an account to God about what we taught. Ask yourself these questions about the information that you're going to present before you present it. And, we've talked about this from the very beginning. This is a great responsibility that we have. We're going to have to answer for the things that we teach. And so, first and foremost, absolutely the question is this correct? And am I teaching the truth? That is the number one question that you need to be asking. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't make a mistake, but that should be at the forefront of our minds with everything that we're teaching. Is it teaching the Bible, or is it teaching truisms or platitudes? Again, are we pushing humanism in our Bible classes, or are we actually teaching what God intended for us to get out of it? Is the material so time-consuming that it hinders my teaching? And that could be something where you've been given this amount of time to teach, but you've got this amount of material. That's a hard thing. And so in that situation, there has to be some compromise somewhere, and you may have to talk to Norm and Jesse and Todd and have some changes or ask for another quarter. Is this the material that is needed at this moment? And I know that the Bible Class Committee puts a lot of effort into this. We as a group have all been able to kind of give our opinions on what we think needs to be taught. And there are certain things that happen throughout the year that's going on within the world that we recognize this is very important. It's something that our kids are dealing with, and so we need to be teaching this at this particular moment. And when we are teaching something for all of these kids, it's a question that we can be asking: is this material needed at this moment? Is it working? Are my students truly learning? And again, if they're not learning, you're not really teaching. Am I relying too heavily on the material, or am I doing my own studying and letting it be the aid that reinforces my lesson? And again, that goes back to the amount of study and the effort that we're putting in. Do I have goals in mind? What am I using? Why am I using this material? So he adds on to that. He says, is it because it is of genuine value, or is it just an easy crutch so I will not have to think what to teach? So again, some things to think about. Control how your class goes. Random talking in a class is rarely valuable. And this is something that you've got to nip it in the bud in the beginning, because if you let things linger, then it can become worse. Unlearned, studied comments are useless at best. And so especially if you've got kids and they are giving their opinions on something, they're obviously unlearned, and so again, you can't let them take over the class with their comments. And it's something that we have been warned about Paul warned us of this in Titus 3:9, but avoid foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. And we can run into this same scenario within our Bible classes where the whole discussion just becomes worthless and unprofitable. So you got to make sure again that you keep it on track. 2 Timothy 2:23, but refuse foolish and ignorant questions, knowing that they produce quarrels. Again, make sure that you are controlling the class because you are the teacher. Teachers today need these instructions today just as much as Titus and Timothy needed them at hand. And if you're having, we'll talk about this some more with the discipline, but if you're having problems and you're trying to address them and they don't seem to be getting fixed, then you definitely have to get the parent involved. All right, I think that's too often we get scared or maybe we're worried, I'm not for sure, but we don't communicate enough with the parents, and you've got a kid that downstairs that's causing some problems and you've tried addressing it in class and it's not fixing itself, so you need to get the parents involved because what happens in that situation, let's say you've got a class of 5 and you've got one that is being a distraction, well, how beneficial is that for the other 4? And so when it happens over and over and over again and you're trying to address it, you're losing all 5 kids. And so if it is a consistent problem, then you definitely need to get the parents involved. The tangential thought or rabbit hole, as I call it, may be a great one and someone may learn a valuable lesson from it, but you're also taking the class away from the primary focus of the teacher, and that disrupts the flow for everyone else. Some rabbit holes are okay, but typically what happens is when you go down one rabbit hole, you know what happens? Yeah, there's rabbit holes here and here and here and there and there, and so then all of a sudden, by the time you get to the end of the class, it's like, I don't even know how we got here. We were having a conversation last night at supper, and it's always like, how do we even get here? It's like, you forget how you even get there. And that can happen to us in Bible class because we start going on so many tangents, going down so many rabbit holes. And that's a benefit to nobody. Many a class has been ruined by the teacher that did not say, let's get back to our main thoughts. And it really is as simple as that. Let's get back to the subject at hand. Let's get back to talking about what we were talking about. And it's very, very important for a teacher to do this. Repetition either by the teacher or by the members of the class is a waste of time. A teacher is not being rude when he cuts a useless discussion short and moves on to valuable information. He is merely taking the position of authority he was asked to accept when he was asked to teach the class. You are the teacher. You control the class. And make sure that you remember that. All right, lesson 11. I kept saying 10, but 11. So specific aids, advantages, and disadvantages. Turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 12. Second Samuel chapter 1 through 7, please.
Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, there were 2 men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And he shall restore fourfold for the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul.
So what was the point of Nathan telling that story? Francis?
To make David think about what horrible thing had happened, but he didn't realize he was the one until he told the story, and then he tells him it's the one.
All right, so the ultimate goal of the story is to let David know you're in sin. Could Nathan have just not walked up and said, "Hey, man, you're in sin for what you just did"? Could he have done that?
He could, but it hit harder with the sheep because David was a shepherd.
All right. So it hit harder. It was more effective. Do you think that David would have recognized probably that, yes, I am in sin, if Nathan would have just come and told him? I believe that he probably would, but the effectiveness of that story, that was an aid to help David recognize how bad of a situation he was in. Because Nathan knew if this was the situation, you see how enraged you are about this situation? And yet here you are doing the exact same thing. Whew. That would hit you pretty hard. Norm?
Power of the stories and why God chose to use these, because it engages the emotion, and it's the emotion there that kicks your body into gear about thinking about this, and then all of a sudden then it comes back and you go, oh man, it's me. Wow.
Yeah. So Nathan's trying to get to this point, and he could have just took a straight line. But he decided to go this way. And this way is a lot more effective. And so we have to recognize as teachers, oftentimes, the stories that we use or the things that we use to try to get to this point, some of them are going to be much more effective than other ways. Now, sometimes we've got to get straight to the point. But sometimes if we can tell the story just the way that Jesus did, just the way that Nathan does here, it can be much more effective. Turn over to Matthew chapter 22. And Linda, if you would read 15 through 22 for us. Matthew 22, 15 through 22.
Then when the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk, and they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that you are true and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of man. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he says unto them, Whose is the image and the superscription? They said unto him, Caesar's. Then says he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way.
All right, so should we be paying a tax to Caesar? How could Jesus have answered the question? He could have just said yes. What did he do instead?
Visual aid.
A visual aid. Now, you think that didn't stick with him? Or bring me a coin. Let's just take a look at it. Now, whose inscription is that on the coin? That visual aid, again, he's trying to get to the point, just answering the question. He could have just went straight to it. No, let's think about it a little bit. That visual aid, again, is something that enhanced the ultimate goal of what he was getting to. And we see this throughout scriptures. Jesus, obviously with all the parables that he used, he's using those as an aid to get to the ultimate story of what he wants the people to understand. And that's something that we can use to our advantage. And again, the particular lesson with the coin, he could have went about it a lot of different ways, but that way was very, very effective. Whenever you read through Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're really using some visual aids some of them very, very graphic, and you can't tell me that those didn't stick with people. And so it's very, these are key things to help us get to where we want to go. Aids can help us do that very, very well. This is something that I found, suggestions from the Polaroid company for suggestions for visual aids. The purpose of a visual aid should focus on the main point. That's what he's been telling us throughout this whole book. Like, don't just have things just random, but make sure that they're getting to the point. If your visual aid becomes distracting, it's ineffective. All right, so if you just created a distraction, it's not really helping them understand or get to the main point, it's a distraction. Keep them simple, keep them in the same style and look. The visual must aid in understanding. A good visual aid will be understood in 15 seconds or less. And I think that once they saw that coin and he asked them whose inscriptions on, they were probably already thinking, oh man, he's got us. He got us. And it didn't take 15 seconds. Quality is important. It's not the only thing, but again, this is something that I found from the Polaroid company and something to think about. So we've talked about workbooks quite a bit, and so some advantages that he mentions is they encourage each individual to do their own study. And again, this is with older students. Whenever they have a lesson that they need to do, we're encouraging them to have this responsibility to do their own work, which again is going to be one repetition whenever they're doing it at home by themselves. Then whenever you do it again in class, now you got another one, so that's 2 of your 30. So they're part of the way there. They help the students to the main idea or lessons in the passage being studied, and so they can aid a student as well in helping them understand and be able to pull main points out along the time the teacher has to teach the material, and sometimes that can be a disadvantage. Some disadvantages that he's talked about, many on the market are very, very poor, and he's talked about this several times. There's just not a lot of good workbooks that are out there. Too many teachers use them as the whole lesson, and so they don't really spend any time in the Word. We're just going to use the workbook. Maybe we're just going to read the workbook, and then we're just going to ask the questions, and we're going to be done. And so you've not really taught if that's what you're doing. You're simply using it as a crutch. Written activities are very time-consuming, especially with the younger pre-K and early elementary. Workbooks for preschool classes often require teacher busy work, possible wide age range in classes. And so when you do have a workbook and you do have a wide age range, maybe it's good for this age range and not for this age range. And so that turns into a disadvantage for the class as a whole. And I just realized I'll have to tell Michael next time, don't add my slides together, because I actually look at this number right here. So I'm like 30. I'm not at 30. I'm supposed to be on slide 5. That's something to pay attention to as a teacher next time. One of the things that he mentions in the book as far as disadvantages with making the selection of the material, he says, obviously making a careful selection of a workbook to use takes time. You cannot run by a bookstore during your lunch hour on Saturday and begin teaching the material the next morning. But that brings us back to one of the basic lessons stressed throughout this book. Good teachers take time to think about the needs of their students and take time to prepare properly. There is no room for lazy, slipshod teachers in this all-important task of teaching God's Word. So workbooks, disadvantages. So this is their idea that they don't use them for these 3 reasons. One, most on the market do not teach enough Bible. This goes back to the humanism class we talked about with lesson 3, that there's a lot of humanism that is in even material that is put out oftentimes by members of the church. And sometimes I don't think that it's intentional, but it's there. They consume too much of the available time. And so, again, whenever you're focused so much on the workbook, you're not really spending as much time in the Word, and which is obviously more important. Too many books sent home are lost or never studied. And he gave one example of himself when he was a younger kid, and maybe this was the one where the teacher was the elder. And so there were several kids in the class, and I think it was the elder, and they would go in and they would just go through the questions, and so they would answer a question, and the teacher would say, next. Well, he was the only one of the kids that ever did his lesson. And so he said what would happen is we'd get into class, and I'd answer it, and I'd just pass my book down. And then the next one would answer and just give the answer I gave, and then they would just pass it on down. And so however many kids was in the class, he's the only one doing it. And he said, to be honest with you, if it wasn't for my parents, I probably wouldn't have done my lesson either, because there really wasn't of any benefit. And so that's one of the reasons why they don't use them. That obviously, that experience stuck with him. And then, yes, a lot of times they get lost. And so those are just some reasons why they don't use them. We tend to forget that workbooks are aids and necessities for our teaching. A workbook is the skeleton, the outline of the material to be taught. And that's something that, again, as teachers, we have to recognize and remember that this is just an aid. This isn't necessarily everything that I need to be talking. This is something else that we've talked about in one of the lessons about being in a rut. So workbooks are not the only way to get a study from your students. Think of new ideas. You are as capable of thinking of activities as the author of your favorite book. And again, oftentimes we don't give ourselves enough credit when it comes to teaching. All right, so we'll pick up with the Bible storybooks. We're going to go through these actually pretty quick, these specific things, and then we'll get into discipline, and we'll probably spend quite a bit of time on the discipline, and then we're going to go rather quickly through the child's level, lessons 13 and 14, before we get into individual age levels. So we'll pick up here next week. Thanks, everybody.